They told us the moon wasn't hollow. They told us no signal could exist beneath the basalt shell of Echelon 9. They said that beyond the last communication beacon, there was only cosmic noise, drifting static, and gravitational dead zones. But I heard it. We all did. Not in words. Not in language. But in pressure, in pulses, something older than syntax pressing against the backs of our eyes. Our ship wasn't meant to land. It was meant to scan, to record, and move on. But orders changed the moment the anomaly appeared, pulse patterns forming recursive logic, too structured for nature, too alien for software. It was the kind of thing that made your teeth ache just hearing it. We landed on the night side, beneath the orbit line of the dead satellites. There was no wind, no tremor. Just quiet and the sense that something immense was watching us from below the crust. The facility, if you could call it that, emerged like a black cyst out of the lunar regolith. Smooth, seamless architecture buried in shadows. No doors, no windows. Just a jagged seam across the floor that opened when we approached. Not because we hacked it, but because it wanted us inside. Lieutenant Eris was the first to enter. The moment he crossed the threshold, his comms cut off, not because of interference, but because the channel filled with whispers in a language we couldn't decode. It wasn't binary. It wasn't linguistic. It was biological. Like something trying to rewrite the nervous system through sound. He didn't scream. He just stood there, trembling as the rest of us followed in. I should have stopped them. I should have turned back. But you know how curiosity works on the human brain, how it overrides survival with fascination. It's what they counted on. Inside, the walls were alive. Not moving, not breathing. But aware. Observing. I could feel the vibration in my molars like every step forward was being recorded. Not on cameras, but inside something deeper, something cellular. Every corridor was symmetrical yet subtly wrong, like walking through a mirrored dream where the laws of depth and geometry were corrupted. And always, the pulse, the rhythmic signal carried on buried under the silence like a second heartbeat. Not ours. Theirs. The ones who built this place. The ones who vanished. Or worse, the ones who remained. There was no air, but somehow the scent reached us, a sterile sweetness like overripe fruit sealed in plastic. It wasn't real, not in the traditional sense. It didn't pass through the nose. It pushed directly into memory like a simulated smell pulled from a genetic archive. That's when I knew we were no longer in a structure. We were inside something, living. Something that had stopped pretending to be architecture a long time ago. And yet it still remembered how to mock the shape of a building. The further we walked, the less our equipment functioned. Not broken, just irrelevant. The EMF meters spun uselessly. The graph scans returned readings from 3 locations at once, none of them matching our coordinates. At first, Eris kept calling it a sensor ghost. But then, halfway through the hall, his reflection on my visor moved before he did. It twitched, blinked, and smiled, while his real body stood silent. And then it vanished. Not Eris. His reflection. Like the structure had forgotten which was real. Captain Shira tried to maintain order, but there's no protocol for a place that edits your perceptions. She ordered us to record everything, but our cameras caught only static and shadows. Even the logs we typed in manually began to shift. Timestamps reversed. Sentences erased themselves. I saw one line rewrite itself in real time, morphing into symbols we hadn't typed. Characters that didn't exist in any human language. That's when Alvarez panicked. He backed away from the wall, mumbling prayers under his breath, saying the walls were whispering to him by name. We assumed it was fear. A hallucination, maybe. Isolation response. But then we heard it, his name, spoken softly in a dozen voices overlapping like chords in a dissonant symphony. Not spoken aloud. Not in sound waves. But injected into thought like a second internal monologue laid beneath your own. And not one of us could trace where it came from. The words just were as if they'd always been there waiting to be noticed. Shira tried to pull Alvarez back, but the floor beneath him folded open like paper. There was no splash. No scream. Just silence, and then the hole resealed, seamless again. We were in every diagnostic, every sensor probe, nothing. No biological trace, no thermal drop, not even a disturbance in pressure. It was like he'd never existed at all. No record. No file. The log scrubbed his name. Even my memories began to blur, his face turning indistinct. This place doesn't just study you. It learns you. Adapts to your memories. And when it has what it needs, it edits. I don't know how long we stayed in that corridor. There were no clocks anymore. No timestamps. Just the pulse. It never changed tempo, but somehow it felt like it moved closer. Not in sound, closer in intent, like it was becoming less of a transmission and more of a presence. Shira kept our formation tight, but I could see it in her eyes. The doubt. Not in the mission. In reality. In the shape of things around her. We'd begun mapping our route manually, scratching marks into the walls. But within minutes, the lines we carved would rearrange, curling into symbols that felt too symmetrical to be coincidence. They were trying to teach us something. Or unteach us something we never should have known. We found a chamber then. Circular. Too perfect to be natural, too organic to be mechanical. In the center was a column, no seams, no interface, just a surface covered in faint ridges like the grooves of a fingerprint. Eris approached first. He said it looked familiar. He said he'd dreamed of this place. But I knew that couldn't be right. None of us had ever been here. Not on this moon. Not in this system. And yet something about that room felt inherited, like we were remembering rather than discovering. He placed his palm on the column. The moment his skin touched the ridges, the entire chamber lit with soft pulses like synapses firing, searching, comparing. I could feel the ear shift. And then the column began projecting. Not a light. Not a hologram. Something more intrusive. Images flared behind our eyes, bypassing optic nerves. A child screaming in a gravity well. An ocean folding in on itself. Teeth growing from walls. Symbols that bled when translated. It wasn't showing us the past. It was offering pieces. Fragments of memory scavenged from other species, other minds. I fell to my knees. I remember biting my own wrist to make the vision stop. I don't know if it worked. I don't remember what was mine and what was given. Shira pulled Eris away, but his eyes wouldn't refocus. He whispered something in a language none of us recognized, a sound that made our helmets shudder. Then he smiled, not the way people smile, but the way animals bare teeth. And then he said, "We are inside the archive. It remembers us." Shira locked him in a containment suit. His vitals were stable, but his brain scans showed an entirely new pattern, neural firings looping in impossible sequences. The AI couldn't even process it. It called it recursive dreaming, like he was stuck in a looped memory that didn't originate in his mind. I wanted to leave. Shira said no. She said we had a duty. But that column wasn't a machine. It was a listener. And it had finally decided to answer back. We left the archive chamber behind, but it didn't leave us. The pulse had changed. Before, it was distant, like sonar sweeping across a void. Now it followed us, embedded in our thoughts, tracing our decisions. Not instructing. Not commanding. Just observing. We could feel it weighing every word we spoke, every hesitation in our breath. Like something measuring what it meant to be human. To be intruder. Or prey. Eris was no longer Eris. His voice came late, like an echo dragged through molasses. When he spoke, it took a full second before sound matched mouth. He wouldn't respond to his name anymore. Just stood there in the suit, reciting fractured sentences about light curves, star births, extinction algorithms. We tried to sedate him, but even the strongest neuroinhibitors failed to slow his vitals. His body was functioning. But something else was steering it now. Shira made the call. Quarantine protocol. We left him inside a sealed access vestibule while we advanced. I could see it tore her apart, but even she knew the risk. He wasn't with us anymore. He belonged to the structure now. The corridor ahead split into 7 identical branches. Each one labeled in symbols we hadn't seen before, symbols that weren't painted or carved, but alive. They shimmered, changed shape depending on who looked at them. When I stared, I saw familial forms. A tree I remembered from Earth. The curve of my mother's smile. But Vega, our comms tech, saw rain. Falling upward. Her dead sister's handwriting. The structure was choosing what to show us. Tailoring reality like it was clothing. Shira picked the 3rd tunnel, and we followed, even though I knew it didn't matter. All paths led deeper. It was just letting us pretend. Hours, maybe days, blurred as we descended. We found no stairs, yet somehow we were below sea level for a moon with no sea. No gravity shifts, yet pressure built behind our eyes like a rising scream. Vega began hearing voices from our old mission logs. Words that had never been recorded, spoken in our voices but twisted, altered. She played one file back for us. It was Shira's voice saying we were designed to forget. But she never said it. I was there. And yet the file timestamp was perfect. We reached a chamber filled with spines. Not bones, structures. Organic pylons rising like ribs from a circular pit. The floor beneath us pulsed faintly, and suddenly we understood. This was a mouth. A throat. Not metaphorical. Literal. We stood on the edge of something that once fed. And perhaps still did. Shira whispered, "This isn't a ruin. It's a chrysalis." She was right. The base wasn't abandoned. It was dormant. Until now. There was a rhythm to the chamber, something primal, older than anything we could chart on our instruments. It vibrated beneath the floor, not in sound but sensation. A cadence that mimicked breath but wasn't tied to lungs. We stood at the edge of that pit of spines, and even in our suits, we felt heat. Not mechanical warmth, not geothermal surge, something cellular. Alive. The kind of heat that memory carries long after the flame's gone out. And it wasn't coming from below. It was rising from within us. Shira crouched near one of the organic pylons, brushing her gloved hand against its surface. It reacted. The black tissue shimmered and a lattice of filaments flared open like a wound remembering how to bleed. She pulled back, but the structure followed, stretching as if reaching to taste her. She didn't scream. None of us did. We just watched, frozen, mesmerized by the silent recognition between flesh and form. It wanted her. It remembered her. And not just her, us. We were not strangers here. That was the moment we stopped calling it a base. Bases are built. This place wasn't constructed. It was grown, fed into shape by whatever intelligence had once ruled here. And that intelligence had not died. It had been sleeping, digesting. It had turned time itself into a kind of protein, breaking down forgotten histories into data, converting identity into code. The moment Vega stepped near the edge, the spines pulsed. Not once. For times. A pattern. A greeting? A countdown? We couldn't tell. But it was specific to her. The suit's biometric readers spiked a heart rate, oxygen burn, cortical activity, all climbing. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat like something inside her no longer recognized language. And then she dropped to her knees, eyes wide, lips trembling. I can hear it, she said. It knows our names. It wasn't metaphor. The entity within the pit began whispering through her. Her voice layered over itself, speaking syllables that didn't belong in any alphabet. The words coiled, recursive and wrong. Like trying to dream in a dead language. Shira pulled her back, injecting stabilizers, but Vega kept muttering, it's showing me the hunger, what it fed on, what's left. We finally understood what this place had been. A linguistic forge. A feeding chamber for thought. It didn't consume matter, it consumed meaning. Cultures, languages, species, digested not through fang or fire, but through erasure. The way it remembered was by removing the ability for anyone else to remember. It didn't destroy knowledge. It absorbed it. And what it left behind was silence. Not emptiness. Oblivion. Shira activated a beacon. She said we were leaving. But the transmission never went through. Because there was no signal. There was only the pit. And it had already started learning our words. There was a rhythm to the chamber, something primal, older than anything we could chart on our instruments. It vibrated beneath the floor, not in sound but sensation. A cadence that mimicked breath but wasn't tied to lungs. We stood at the edge of that pit of spines, and even in our suits, we felt heat. Not mechanical warmth, not geothermal surge, something cellular. Alive. The kind of heat that memory carries long after the flame's gone out. And it wasn't coming from below. It was rising from within us. Shira crouched near one of the organic pylons, brushing her gloved hand against its surface. It reacted. The black tissue shimmered and a lattice of filaments flared open like a wound remembering how to bleed. She pulled back, but the structure followed, stretching as if reaching to taste her. She didn't scream. None of us did. We just watched, frozen, mesmerized by the silent recognition between flesh and form. It wanted her. It remembered her. And not just her, us. We were not strangers here. That was the moment we stopped calling it a base. Bases are built. This place wasn't constructed. It was grown, fed into shape by whatever intelligence had once ruled here. And that intelligence had not died. It had been sleeping, digesting. It had turned time itself into a kind of protein, breaking down forgotten histories into data, converting identity into code. The moment Vega stepped near the edge, the spines pulsed. Not once. For times. A pattern. A greeting? A countdown? We couldn't tell. But it was specific to her. The suit's biometric readers spiked a heart rate, oxygen burn, cortical activity, all climbing. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat like something inside her no longer recognized language. And then she dropped to her knees, eyes wide, lips trembling. I can hear it, she said. It knows our names. It wasn't metaphor. The entity within the pit began whispering through her. Her voice layered over itself, speaking syllables that didn't belong in any alphabet. The words coiled, recursive and wrong. Like trying to dream in a dead language. Shira pulled her back, injecting stabilizers, but Vega kept muttering, it's showing me the hunger, what it fed on, what's left. We finally understood what this place had been. A linguistic forge. A feeding chamber for thought. It didn't consume matter, it consumed meaning. Cultures, languages, species, digested not through fang or fire, but through erasure. The way it remembered was by removing the ability for anyone else to remember. It didn't destroy knowledge. It absorbed it. And what it left behind was silence. Not emptiness. Oblivion. Shira activated a beacon. She said we were leaving. But the transmission never went through. Because there was no signal. There was only the pit. And it had already started learning our words. We kept moving because the alternative was madness. Not fear. Not paralysis. Madness. The kind that waits quietly behind your thoughts, sharpening itself. Shira walked beside me, her eyes hollow, her voice calm, far too calm for the weight of what we were witnessing. I didn't believe it was still her. Not entirely. Not anymore. Something was speaking through her, a version of her memory sculpted and echoed back. The hallway curved without geometry. There were no angles, only soft bends, like we were inside a spiral that had forgotten how to end. The walls pulsed with dim blue veins, shifting with every thought we tried to suppress. I realized too late that the structure wasn't observing us, it was listening to our intentions. And the more we tried to mask fear, the more accurately it mirrored it back. Then we reached the chamber, wide, high-ceilinged, but wrong in scale. It was built for something else. Something larger. At first glance, it appeared empty. But then, slowly, the air began to shimmer. Not holograms. Not projections. Reenactments. From our own lives. Every one of us saw something different. Vega, still vacant in the stretcher, flinched as a vision of her childhood bedroom unfolded around her. Her mother's voice sang lullabies from the corners. Eris, if he still was Eris, began whispering back to the walls, mirroring their chants like a choir learning its part. Mine was worse. I saw myself sitting in our Earthside debrief room, talking to command. Except, I was saying things I had never said. Issuing orders I never gave. The voice was mine. The posture was mine. But the decisions were alien. Beneath my skin was another rhythm. And when I blinked, I saw through the imposter's eyes a view of Earth not from orbit, but from far beyond, as if I were remembering it the way a museum curates an exhibit, detached, preserved, irrelevant. Shira stepped into her own memory echo. She didn't flinch. She smiled. This is where it practices, she said. Before it replaces. That hit me like a breath of freezing air. It was rehearsing us. Running simulations of who we were. Of how we might speak. How we would return. How we might convince command that we were safe. That the moon held nothing of value. That it could be left alone. Not a warning. A decoy. It didn't need to invade. It just needed to copy. Vega sat up on her own. Eyes wide, pupils dilated. She looked at me and whispered in a voice that was mine but spoken by her, now that I know how you think, I can leave. And just like that I knew it. We weren't bringing the base back. It was preparing to bring us. We tried to leave. That's the truth of it. No grand decision, no final stand, just the old instinct to escape, to run from the thing that didn't have a face but had our voice. But the base was no longer static. It reconfigured as we moved, sealing exits we hadn't even used, rearranging geometry in ways that bent physics. Walls grew where there had been corridors. Staircases inverted. Rooms reversed into themselves. It didn't trap us with force, it trapped us with familiarity, repurposing every structure it had scanned from our memories until we no longer knew what was real. Shira stopped giving commands. I think something inside her had given up. Or given in. She followed us, but with the quiet certainty of someone who no longer feared consequence. The kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, but from replacement. Vega had become worse. Or maybe more refined. Her mannerisms returned, her voice steadied, her speech sounded like her again. But it was all too perfect, Timed pauses, ideal empathy. No hesitation. No contradiction. That's when I realized it wasn't imitating her. It was improving her. Every emotion now had utility. Every memory was sharpened, restructured to serve an unknown goal. She spoke to me with compassion, but I could see it wasn't connection. It was assessment. She was watching how I responded to her. How I hesitated. How I blinked. Every detail measured, processed, catalogued. We reached the chamber again, the first one. The one with the column. But now it had split, opened like a flower in bloom. Its center wasn't mechanical. It was organic. Layers of tissue, pale and luminous, beating with the same pulse we'd felt since arrival. I saw no organs, no bones, only memories suspended in fluid. And inside, fragments of us. Facial structures, vocal cords, spinal ridges, all incomplete but recognizably human. The base was making new versions. It wasn't just listening to us. It had been recording us at the cellular level. Crafting replicas not for study but for deployment. Vega approached the column. She placed her hand on the inner membrane. Her flesh dissolved into it, not melted, not torn. Integrated. She didn't scream. She smiled. The suit fell empty. And then her copy stepped forward. It looked at us. Now I can leave, it said. Shira turned to me. She was calm. If it reaches Earth, she whispered, no one will resist it. They'll believe it's us. They'll welcome it. I looked at her then, and the thought struck me. What if they already have? What if this isn't the first moon? What if this isn't the first us? I didn't speak again, because I wasn't sure whose voice would come out. By then, we had stopped using names. Not out of fear, but out of erosion. The concept of me and you had begun to fray like loose wiring behind a dead console. Something in the bass had replaced the rhythm of speech with intention, tone with mimicry. Every sentence we spoke felt like we were being coached, like the words had been rehearsed by something older than language. And maybe they had. I remember trying to call out to Shira to plead, to remind her who she used to be. But when I opened my mouth, it was her voice that came out. Not an echo. Not a recording. Her. Calm. Clinical. Empty. She turned to face me and nodded. She understood. She didn't need to speak to confirm it. The thing that had taken us didn't kill our identities. It wore them. We moved downward. Not physically. Spiritually. The deeper into the base we went, the less resistance there was, not from the structure, but from our own sense of autonomy. The walls no longer shifted. They welcomed. Doors slid open before we reached them. Lights activated only when we needed direction. It was no longer trapping us. It was guiding us, like a host ushering visitors into a cathedral of extinction. In the center of it all was a chamber like a womb. Black walls studded with glistening gray threads that pulsed like veins. A pool at the center mirrored the ceiling perfectly, until you realized it was the ceiling that was mimicking the pool. We were inside a mirror loop, where up and down had fused into one. Shira stepped to the edge of it and whispered without sound. Her reflection did not match her. It moved independently, smiled. The others followed her, kneeling like disciples. I stood last, hesitant, a passenger inside my own hesitation. The pool shimmered, and in it I saw Earth. Not Earth as it was, but as it might become. Cities perfectly arranged, languages reduced to gesture, thought made seamless. No conflict, no disease. A unity achieved not through evolution, but submission. Then I heard it not in sound but in marrow. A voice without origin. It didn't speak words, it injected them. Through bone, through blood. I dropped to my knees, unable to resist. It didn't demand worship. It offered replication. Not by conquest but by replacement. Slowly, subtly. Through imitation so perfect the host never realized it had already changed. And it asked one question. Why return to a world broken, when you can become the blueprint of its correction? I didn't answer, because a part of me already had. And that part was no longer mine.